Section 20 of Popular Tales from the Norse. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Linda Ferguson. Popular Tales from the Norse by Sir George Webb Dasent. Section 20. Princess on the Glass Hill. Once upon a time there was a man who had a meadow which lay high up on the hillside, and in the meadow was a barn which he had built to keep his hay in. Now I must tell you there hadn't been much in the barn for the last year or two, for every St. John's night, when the grass stood greenest and deepest, the meadow was eaten down to the very ground the next morning, just as if a whole drove of sheep had been there feeding on it overnight. This happened once, and it happened twice, so at last the man grew weary of losing his crop of hay, and said to his sons, for he had 3 of them, and the youngest was nicknamed Boots, of course, that now one of them must just go and sleep in the barn in the outlying field when St. John's night came, for it was too good a joke that his grass should be eaten root and blade this year as it had been the last 2 years. So whichever of them went must keep a sharp lookout. That was what their father said. Well, the eldest son was ready to go and watch the meadow. Trust him for looking after the grass. It shouldn't be his fault if a man or beast, or the fiend himself, got a blade of grass. So when evening came he set off to the barn and lay down to sleep, but a little on in the night came such a clatter and such an earthquake that walls and the roof shook and groaned and creaked. Then up jumped the lad, and took to his heels as fast as ever he could, nor dared he once look round till he reached home. And as for the hay, why, it was eaten up this year just as it had been twice before. The next St. John's night the man said again, it would never do to lose all the grass in the outlying field year after year in this way, so one of his sons must just trudge off to watch it, and watch it well too. Well, the next oldest son was ready to try his luck, so he set off, and lay down to sleep in the barn, as his brother had done before him. But as the night wore on, there came on a rumbling and a quaking of the earth, worse even than on last St. John's night, and when the lad heard it he got frightened, and took to his heels as though he were running a race. Next year the turn came to Boots, but when he made ready to go, the other 2 began to laugh and to make a game of him, saying, "You're just the man to watch the hay, that you are. You have done nothing all your life but sit in the ashes and toast yourself by the fire." But Boots did not care a pin for their chattering, and stumped away as evening drew on, up the hillside to the outlying field. There he went inside the barn and lay down. But in about an hour's time the barn began to groan and creak, so that it was dreadful to hear. "Well," said Boots to himself, "if it isn't worse than this, I can stand it well enough." A little while after came another creak and an earthquake, so that the litter in the barn flew about the lad's ears. "Oh," said Boots to himself, "if it isn't worse than this, I dare say I can stand it out." But just then came a third rumbling and a third earthquake, so that the lad thought walls and roof were coming down on his head. But it passed off, and all was still as death about him. "It'll come again, I'll be bound," thought Boots. But no, it didn't come again. Still it was, and still it stayed. But after he had lain a little while, he heard a noise as if a horse was standing just outside the barn door and cropping the grass. He stole to the door, and peeped through a chink, and there stood a horse feeding away. So big and fat and grand a horse Boots had never set eyes on. By his side on the grass lay a saddle and bridle, and a full set of armour for a knight, all of brass, so bright that the light gleamed from it. "Ho, ho!" thought the lad, "it's you, is it, that eats up our hay? I'll soon put a spoke in your wheel, just see if I don't." So he lost no time, but took the steel out of his tinder box, and threw it over the horse. Then it had no power to stir from the spot, and became so tame that the lad could do what he liked with it. So he got on its back and rode off with it to a place which no one knew of, and there he put up the horse. When he got home his brothers laughed and asked how he had fared. "You didn't lie long in the barn, even if you had the heart to go so far as the field." "Well," said Boots, "all I can say is, I lay in the barn till the sun rose, and neither saw nor heard anything. I can't think what there was in the barn to make you both so afraid." "A pretty story," said his brothers, "but we'll soon see how you have watched the meadow. So they set off, but when they reached it, there stood the grass as deep and thick as it had been overnight. Well, the next St. John's Eve it was the same story over again. Neither of the elder brothers dared to go out to the outlying field to watch the crop, but Boots, he had the heart to go, and everything happened just as it had happened the year before. First a clatter and an earthquake, then a greater clatter and another earthquake, and so on a third time, only this year the earthquakes were far worse than the year before. Then all at once everything was still as death, and the lad heard how something was cropping the grass outside the barn door. So he stole to the door and peeped through a chink, and what do you think he saw? Why, another horse standing right up against the wall and chewing and champing with might and main. It was far finer and fatter than that which came the year before, and it had a saddle on its back and a bridle on its neck, and a full suit of mail for a knight lay by its side, all of silver, and as grand as you would wish to see. "Ho, ho!" said Boots to himself, "it's you that gobbles up our hay, is it? I'll soon put a spoke in your wheel." And with that he took the steel out of his tinder box and threw it over the horse's crest, which stood as still as a lamb. Well, the lad rode this horse, too, to the hiding place where he kept the other one, and after that he went home. "I suppose you'll tell us," said one of his brothers, "there's a fine crop this year, too, up in the hayfield." "Well, so there is," said Boots, and off ran the others to see, and there stood the grass thick and deep, as it was the year before, but they didn't give Boots softer words for all that. Now when the third St. John's Eve came, the two elders still hadn't the heart to lie out in the barn and watch the grass, for they had got so scared at heart the night they lay there before, that they couldn't get over the fright. But Boots, he dared to go, and to make a long story short, the very same thing happened this time as had happened twice before. 3 earthquakes came, one after the other, each worse than the one which went before, and when the last came, the lad danced about with the shock from one barn wall to the other, and after that, all at once, it was still as death. Now when he had lain a little while, he heard something tugging away at the grass outside the barn, so he stole again to the door chink, and peeped out, and there stood a horse close outside, far, far bigger and fatter than the 2 he had taken before. "Ho, ho!" said the lad to himself, "it's you, is it, that comes here eating up our hay? I'll soon stop that. I'll soon put a spoke in your wheel." So he caught up his steel and threw it over the horse's neck, and in a trice it stood as if it were nailed to the ground, and Boots could do as he pleased with it. Then he rode off with it to the hiding place where he kept the other 2, and then went home. When he got home his 2 brothers made game of him, as they had done before, saying they could see he had watched the grass well, for he looked for all the world as if he were walking in his sleep, and many other spiteful things they said, but Boots gave no heed to them, only asking them to go and see for themselves. And when they went, there stood the grass as fine and deep this time as it had been twice before. Now you must know that the king of the country where Boots lived had a daughter, whom he would only give to the man who could ride up over the hill of glass, for there was a high, high hill, all of glass, as smooth and slippery as ice, close by the king's palace. Upon the tip-top of the hill the king's daughter was to sit, with 3 golden apples in her lap, and the man who could ride up and carry off the 3 golden apples was to have half the kingdom and the princess to wife. This the king had stuck up on all the church doors in his realm, and had given it out in many other kingdoms besides. Now this princess was so lovely that all who set eyes on her fell over head and ears in love with her, whether they would or no. So I needn't tell you how all the princes and knights who heard of her were eager to win her to wife, and half the kingdom beside, and how they came riding from all parts of the world on high prancing horses, and clad in the grandest clothes, for there wasn't one of them who hadn't made up his mind that he, and he alone, was to win the princess. So when the day of trial came, which the king had fixed, there was such a crowd of princes and knights under the glass hill that it made one's head whirl to look at them, and every one in the country who could even crawl along was off to the hill, for they all were eager to see the man who was to win the princess. So the 2 elder brothers set off with the rest. But as for Boots, they said outright he shouldn't go with them, for if they were seen with such a dirty changeling,